know you heard me on the radio. Flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K. I know you heard me on the radio. Flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K.
Night Watch fans, it's been a little bit since we've talked because we are in the off season, but I have a special treat for you, and we're going to have a lot more of it on this channel going forward. I promised you content. We are going to be bringing you content, and I have the great David Anderson, who many of you are familiar with from his column on the banks and other content he's brought forth on Aaron Brightman's podcast and elsewhere. We are going to be, this is the first of a few-part mini-series entitled the Embracing the Future of College Athletics. And I think it's an interesting topic. It's on everybody's mind, especially given the basketball season and NIL and all these things that have been percolating in everybody's mind for so long. And David and I thought it would be cool to delve into that subject and some other subjects you will see on the horizon. With that, I will bring on my colleague, David Anderson. David, how are you? How you been? Tell the people what you've been up to.
Oh, I'm doing well. As people who may have followed Aaron's podcast know, I have two full-time jobs. I work in tech and I'm a realtor, and it's very, very busy as a real estate agent. I'm licensed in Florida, North and South Carolina, so it's always a lot going on with that, as especially people from the Northeast continue to move down. So been good. How about yourself? How have you been?
Pretty good, man. Hustling the same as you with the full-time jobs and everything. You're crisscrossing the country with all that, people moving and keeping track of it. So it's cool to hear what you've been doing on your grind. And I want to jump right into this now. I mean, it's on people's mind. And honestly, I got to be honest with you, after the basketball season for me, just seeing so much of the roster, and now we're seeing that some of the pieces obviously are staying, but so many guys leaving every year and then coming back, trying to keep up with paying these players. You know, it's like a mercenary regime every year, especially in basketball. Things have been a little different, I think, with Rutgers football, and feel free to reference that. But why should we? I mean, the title of this is Embracing the Future of College Athletics. I mean, why should we embrace it, especially with basketball? I'm feeling a little bit, apathetic when it comes to college ball right now, especially basketball. And why should the people embrace it, David?
Well, I think there's, two quick answers to that. One is we're kind of in the end of a golden age in college athletics. I mean, I think one of the things that's going to continue to come up, and I know a lot of people have mentioned kind of pickpocket spots here, is like, ultimately every other country pretty much has this club sports model that makes it different than the United States has for college athletics. And so when money's your main driver, that's one thing. So we don't know where it's going. And so really we should enjoy the last parts of what was really a golden age in that sense. And then the other thing is, because there's so much uncertainty about how you probably are going to get to that point or where it's going to go, how long it's going to take, there is an opportunity to enjoy each season individually. And I'm really a person who doesn't like recency bias. I don't like not having the long game in mind, but to try to think where we're going to be 10 years from now is what we're going to attempt to do in this conversation. But I mean, you really have to just kind of enjoy the moment. And as someone who struggled with that in life for most of my life until recent years, I mean, we kind of just need to do like what Greg Schiano preaches all the time and be where our feet are right now and kind of just adjust with the times as they come. So again, it's not that I'm a little bit bearish on the long-term future, which means that you kind of got to enjoy the moment that you're in at the point we're in right now.
I get that. And so, but is there something to be said? Because my biggest disconnect is not per se paying the players. I always agreed with somebody making money off their name, image, and likeness, because that seems to me like almost like a foundational, fundamental right of every human. If you're a great player and you want to sign autographs, or some guy wants to hire you to, advocate for or advertise their local business, I'm all for it. Should have been done years ago. But now they're saying it's NIL and it's really just pay for play. Talk about that, but I'm not so against that. What bothers me, I think, as a Rutgers guy is part of the allure of college athletics to me was that I'm rooting for guys who are students at my university who are going to matriculate at my university. They're going to get a degree. And if I didn't go to the university, then I was a fan because I was from the state or there was some family tradition. And these guys had some shared experience with me that we were going to cherish forever. And I could root for them for 4 years. And that shared experience was what set it apart from pro sports for me. And that's what made the community so good. I think with football right now, I'm feeling a little bit more of the love with these guys, even though there's pay for play, the way that it's structured, not just with Rutgers, but overall, but especially with Rutgers. They're still matriculating a lot of guys. They're still there for a long time. The money's being used for some transfers and to retain guys. Whereas in basketball, why should I'm a Rutgers fan because of those reasons. It's tough. I get what you're saying about staying grounded in the moment. If they have a memorable season in basketball, we'll all enjoy it. And I get not going too far ahead, but what's the counter to that, or what's just your thoughts on it? Because it bothers me. I think it bothers a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely with you. I think back to Sports Illustrated ran a story in the late 90s. I want to say it was maybe 99 about all these reasons why college basketball was better than pro basketball. And now it's basically the same. And so, you're kind of like, well, what are we doing here? And I'm totally with you. I didn't attend Rutgers. My parents did. And my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, they've tried to distance themselves from some of this already. Like the Ivy League only allows you to play 4 years and have red shirts, all this sort of thing. And so it's sad for me to see the same thing, right? Because it's kind of turning into a bar where it's all people who no one's a local and everyone's just there for work on the weekdays, and then they rotate in and out. Like it was an institution of some sort that drew you to it. That
Yes.
And there are some pro sports franchises that have that feel. Not as many in the New York area. Maybe the Yankees to some extent, but if you go other places in the country, yeah, like the Pittsburgh Steelers or whatever, they have figured out how to make it work at the pro level. And so really the hope is that maybe you have a coach who becomes a legend for a long period of time. And we felt like we were on that path with Peichel, where even if the players change, that ultimately, you have this core of, coaches, boosters, alums that is kind of like part of what you're really signing up for rather than the names on the back of the jersey. But yeah, I'm totally with you in that it's sad to see this go the way it did, because what made college sports so great from a player standpoint is they're different every year, but not so different that it's just a complete team of mercenaries. So you don't have to worry like, hey, the Patriots have Tom Brady for 20 years, we're screwed. But at the same time, there is always some balance of stability and turnover, and now we're kind of totally skewed on the opposite extreme, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't know what to say other than there are some professional franchises that have figured out how to make this work, whether they be in the US or abroad, that are kind of this full money model. And so hopefully Rutgers can settle into one of those that figures out how to do it rather than one that is just never figured it out.
And that's a great point because, even in pro sports, you're right. I mean, you go back decades and, before free agency, obviously guys were legacies to those franchises and the localities, and with the mishmash of, tech and media and how quickly we can gain access to things, some of the locality is diminished. And with free agency and then a lot more movement, even of legendary players like Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, quarterbacks who really stayed at one franchise most of the year. And I'm talking about football, but it's kind of maybe every sport has gone through it, maybe even more so than football even before that. But some franchises have been able to master the identity, the cultural relevance, and the locality, and to maintain these players long term and kind of go down in lore. And you would hope that Rutgers maybe could accomplish that. And I do think with football, we're kind of headed that way, which serves as a good segue, David, into our conversation here on part one of this mini series of embracing the future. And it is what it is. Shianos always says, right, if you can't change something, you better change how you think about it. I couldn't agree more with that. I use it in my day-to-day life. The coach is an inspiration to all of us in Jersey, not just on the field. Let's talk about step one, which has gotten a lot of discussion, A lot of the other podcasts have discussed it. A lot of the reporters. It's going on in the college world, and it's something I think a big point of emphasis, specifically with basketball, because there's so much management year in and year out. But I think football would benefit too. Although I think with Schiano, you might already have the infrastructure internally in that program. But where does a general manager in college sports fit into this thing? How do they come in? What do they do? How much control do they have? You're looking at head coaches, and they usually, for years had plenary control over the roster. Guys could bring them a player or whatnot, but they were kind of the GM. You bring in a guy who's going to help manage the money. How would that look to you? And how would it be structured here with respect to either sport or both sports?
Yeah, I mean, when you say both sports, we're mainly talking about football and basketball because they're the main revenue generators. Obviously, some schools, maybe ice hockey or women's basketball or, even baseball, some places in the South. But for the most part, we're talking football and basketball. I think it depends on the school. And one of the actual reasons to be not excited, but to actually follow closely is because this is a unique time where some schools are going to zig while others are zagging, and not everyone is going to operate in the same exact way. And that's actually more, entertaining in a sense because, not everyone just got the same thing. Like for a while, so it happens in football a lot. Everyone runs the same offense.
Yep.
And then somebody comes up with an innovation and okay, and everybody else runs the same.
Yes.
And it's like, it's more interesting when, the West Coast offense was invented or the Wildcat comes back.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, obviously there was a lot of variants of the single wing and all that in the past, but things kind of come back around. And so to me, I think that you kind of have two choices. If you have a coach who is better served as a general manager role, then you kind of have the coach move into that space and then they come up with ways of delegating. If you have a coach who's a better game day strategist, give me the guys, I'll make it work. And just to kind of tease something that we've talked about, we might get to some point. It's like, where does Schiano fit in the hierarchy of like how good of a coach he can be? Because certain guys need certain players. Other guys say, just give them to me and we'll make it work.
Preview of another episode between you and I soon, by the way, on this channel. We're going to talk about that.
So I guess, okay, how do I see it going for Rutgers football, to make a long story short? I think Greg Schiano is basically going to be the general manager. And it's not crazy to think in this way because in many athletic departments, the football coach has more clout than the athletic director already.
Mm-hmm.
So in those scenarios, it's really not that big of a departure from like who has the final stamp for anything related to football. And because there's so many position groups, I think that's fairly normal. I mean, that's kind of what John Harbaugh does with the Ravens. He was a special teams coach and became more of a CEO, was not a coordinator on either side. I think that kind of something I said on a recent podcast with Aaron last year was I think when we were looking at Schiano being rehired, if we knew what we know now about where the sport is going, I think all of us would have probably been a little bit more bullish on his hiring because the things he does well are becoming more important. Fundraising, getting everyone in alignment, just being an overall CEO of the group. I think that's ultimately where it's going to go with football. What I see with that, if football has a quote general manager, they're going to do one of two things or both. Basically, they're the head of accounts receivable and the head of accounts payable, right? This is the amount Schiano comes to his desk. This is how much we think this guy's worth on the open market and go from there. Now, treating players like commodities, not great, but ultimately I think that they're going to be almost like a salary division within the football team that is handling that. Now, Schiano is still going to be your chief fundraiser, but that is going to be basically the role, kind of like you saw with Davidson bringing Steph Curry on as like an assistant general manager. He's just there to just raise money. He's not there to compute the salary cap. But I feel like Rutgers football is, like you said, they have a structure in place that I think it's going to be pretty easy for them to just kind of add on. Oh, we need someone else to do this part. Need someone else to do this part and go from there.
Like, I don't know if they are like on paper, they have those roles assigned, but it seems to me as an outsider, I'm not an internal reporter, but it seems like they are able to, he's fundraising. They're designating money that we don't know the ins and outs of, but they're figuring out who fits where because whatever they're doing, it's working. They're retaining guys. They're bringing guys in. It seems to have actually ramped up and gotten better over the last couple of years. And we'll talk about the ins and outs of the on the field product and how, in another episode, but it seems like they have that structure in place, whether they formally do it or not. Now, basketball, and I want to continue the football. If you bring a GM type into the athletic department, and I know you don't know 100% because you're not in the athletic department, but your ideal world, would you bring a guy in to the athletic department who's going to handle this for everybody or consult on some programs, or would this be a basketball specific guy, and footballers already doing their own thing? And how would that look?
Yeah, I think basketball is a little bit of a unique animal, and this predates NIL. Just coaches get players from programs that they trust. I mean, you look at Smoke Williamson and how much clout he has on the recruiting trail, and I think, I think we're going to talk a lot about the coaches in this. I think what scares a lot of fans about Steve Peichel is that he is very confident in his ability to teach players.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes more off of trust than what a player's skill set is today. And so he's had success looking at guys a few years down the line, but now you might not have them down the line. And so I feel like basketball is going to need a more strong-handed person when it comes to talent acquisition that is kind of, this is how much this player is worth. This is a comparable player and how he's done, and managing some of the politics, because Steve Peichel is a nice guy. And that's one of the things that makes families like him. But I think he's going to need a heavy-handed person kind of like to go in there. I mean, my dad owns a construction company that played for Rutgers baseball. But then my mom at times will help him with the business. My mom, who is two-time captain of the gymnastics team, for those who didn't know, and my mom will just be like, no, that's just not a good deal. My dad's such a nice guy that he doesn't want in this negotiation. He'd rather just get started with the project and take a few less dollars and not deal with this frustration.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's where basketball needs that. I mean, on the other side, I think from a fundraising standpoint, people are floating like the name of Danny Breslauer, for example. Someone like that who just knows everybody, there may be a place for that as well. And I'm not sure if there's one person that can do both of those, again, accounts receivable, accounts payable type roles.
Mm-hmm.
But I think basketball, they're really going to need somebody who is like, there's only so many spots on the team. And they're going to need someone who's real firm and like, no, we don't have a spot for this. No, we don't have a spot for a third center this year. Or we don't have room to pay 3-point guards under 6'2" or this year, or whatever. And I think that's where the rubber's going to hit the road. And that's what concerns me about basketball, because again, I think Steve Peichel brings a lot to the table. But the shift of college, as good as it is for Shiano, the reverse is probably true for Peichel in this circumstance, unfortunately. And he's going to need to find guys who do opposite skills of him to augment the staff, and then tie back into what you're saying about we're fans of an institution and a collective group of personalities rather than the players on an individual year-to-year basis. That's kind of how I think basketball has to do it. You don't throw the baby out the bathwater. Instead, just try to figure out like how do we fill these gaps that our staff is not strong with right now, and that might be different in 10 years, but that's how I see it right now.
That makes sense, and I even the opposite too, right? Like it seems like Pike is a real old school handshake guy, which I admire. I'm like that too, and you enter into things with people. You want to have a multi-year development. You kind of, it seems like, and I'm not inside, right? So I don't know 100%, and don't take anybody out there. This is, reporting. This is just speculation. But from what I've seen in the reports that are out there, it also seems like the reverse is true sometimes, where a guy, says, look, my value on the market is this. And Pike kind of says, hey, we paid you already, or, we're not going to pay up that much and eat up that much of our salary because we got all these other guys. If that's how you feel, you can take it to the market, and that's okay, because I'm a stand-up guy who, we made a deal where we're in this together. But I think maybe both ways, that other personality. And I think you're right about fundraising on the one hand, but management on the other. Somebody to say, this guy's worth it now, Steve, and we're going to have to stick with him, or no, let this guy go. Now, speaking of that, how does that look? And we spoke a little bit before this show, and we talked about a couple aspects of how that type of management actually looks. And it looks like you're saying it would almost be, whether the AD is formally the employer or the basketball program. This looks like a basketball program specific thing. Would that encompass, I know this is not the primary focus of this channel, but would that be men's and women's basketball? And we don't have to go too far into a tangent, or would that be specific to just one of those programs and really be beholden to the vision of the head coach, in this case, Steve Peichel?
I mean, I think Rutgers, my thought would be Rutgers could have some sort of shared staff, that there may be somebody who's focused with men, somebody who's focused with women's, but a lot of this stuff is overlapping, and I think it would be foolish to silo them too far on the outsides when in effect they play in the same facilities, arenas, right? You know, a lot of that could be streamlined if you did it together. But that's an excellent point. I try to just think about, again, like with pro sports. Some teams have it where the coach reports direct to the owner.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have it where the coach reports to the GM, who reports to the owner. And I think both ways can work if you have a strong leadership and everyone understands what they're doing. And I feel like you could take that down a level even further, right? Because in effect, you could have your position coaches in football reporting to the coordinator, reporting to the coach, but at some point you end up with too many levels of hierarchy for any of us who have worked in the corporate world,
Mm-hmm.
right? There is such a thing as too much bureaucracy, but
yeah.
I think I would probably think it's easier to start with an overlapping for men's and women's, so that they, in basketball this is, so that they kind of see what each other's doing, as this is such a new world. And then if it makes sense to split that off in the future, I think that's easier than like combining teams down the line. But again, who's their boss? That's where it kind of gets weird. Like, we know Shiano has more clout than most ADs, just like most football coaches do. So like, he has more clout than the AD, who has more clout than these other teams. So then basketball subservient to football once again. I don't really know. Like, what do you think would be the best for Rutgers, which may or may not be the same as other teams in the Big Ten, SEC, or other conferences?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that Rutgers is going to have a limited, initially at least, a limited ability to hire this type of person and to put them on payroll and to do all those things. So I think I would probably start out with somebody in that position, technically in the athletic department, right? But I think they would have to be, a situation where, and this is where it gets tough. This is where it gets tough because you don't know if the new AD and the new president is necessarily aligned long-term with the head basketball coach. Whereas I think Shiano, it's probably part of the deal coming in, no matter who you're talking to. I wonder if it's like that with basketball, because I would think that the athletic department would want to make the hire and would want to make sure that the hire is aligned with the long-term aspirations and cultural, stratifications of the current head coach, but that the GM would kind of be beholden to the athletic department, would be paid by the athletic department, not the basketball program, even though it's the same stream of money. I get it, but it's not necessarily, because the budget is a lot allocated by program. But, I think that they would probably be an athletic department person who would deal with multiple programs, namely at least the men's and women's basketball program. That's how I would see it. We have yet to see how it's going to go, and I'm going to be curious to it. But speaking of that person and what they would do, we had some notes here just regarding what that would look like. So now the person's in the job, no matter how it's structured, they have a task at hand, and the task at hand is to develop and put on the court the best product possible. Now, I discussed reporting by Brian Fonseca from a few weeks ago on my last video. And he had cited stats out there on NIL, right? And the way it looked was that if you were looking at the Power 5 or Power 4, whatever you want to say, in basketball, the spending in the 90th percentile was only $3 million, it looked like. Now, I know that teams like Indiana were upwards of $5 million, and I know that the Big Ten in general has some big spenders, but it looked like Rutgers, granted, this is with the $1 million from going out to Vegas. Granted, this is with some of those things that are not the traditional, hey, we just have a big fund here to play with from donors. But Rutgers looked to be by his stats kind of in the middle of the pack of those major conferences with their total NIL. But then you're reading all these stories that, look, this guy's getting 7 figures, and he was, would have been a mid-range guy in general. This guy's getting high 6 figures at this lower major, team. I mean, the note I have is, first thing you have to do if you get that job is ascertain how much money you need in order to be competitive, and you got to go out and find ways to raise that money. in your estimation, or based on what you do know, and if you don't know, like me, say it. I mean, what does that dollar figure look like? Who are we competing with? We probably are never competing with the upper echelon, and we brought in upper echelon recruits this year and still really didn't get there. We didn't have the money that these other teams had anyway. I mean, what does it look like as a ballpark? Who are we competing with, and what does that dollar amount look like? Do we even know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. Well, I'll answer the first part. I think it's a little easier about like what are you trying to accomplish? I mean, from a standpoint as a fan, right? I have always been the same way ever since the '90s with Rutgers football and basketball. They were not at a point where they need to be okay. How do we beat the top 2 or 3 teams in the conference? We're not there, right? Really, what we're trying to do is okay. How is Rutgers basketball the best basketball team in the state of New Jersey in the college ranks? Right?
Fair enough.
That's the first bar, which
Mhm.
this year was historically the worst year for New Jersey college basketball. I think people were tweeting out. And so maybe that's a fairly low bar, but I feel like just be that first.
Mhm.
And that's even, something that I thought about with Rutgers football back in, in the 90s when it's like, we just please win a couple games. Like the top of the Big East was not even in our minds. It was just don't
Right.
be an embarrassment.
Mhm.
And so from that standpoint, I think that's where you kind of enter the Moneyball approach, right?
Mhm.
And I think we're going to talk a lot more about individualized players, but just give an example, right? I'll take D'Angelo Russell because local fans are probably familiar with him, right?
Mhm.
D'Angelo Russell has been a pretty expendable player when he's been on top tier teams like
Mhm.
the Warriors, the Lakers with LeBron. But when he's been a primary ball handler
Right.
on his team, he can be an engine. And for anyone even if you don't know D'Angelo Russell, anyone who's played basketball, you go play pickup. And that always amazed me when I would be watching because we used to, you wait for your turn to run and everything like that. And there's certain guys who just disappear in certain games. But then if they're the one carrying the load, their team is maybe not winning, but they're competitive. And I
Yes.
feel like that's one of the biggest misses for Rutgers this year was Tyson Acuff because I think that's the type of player that they're going to need. And so I know I'm working backwards to forwards for your point. I'll get back to it in a
Mhm.
second. But basically, historically, Rutgers has always had success in football and basketball when they have gotten raw athletes that would eventually be able to compete, but they're going to have to be driven by a couple skill guys.
Yes.
And that has always been true for Rutgers basketball when you look at the times that they've been successful. And that's where I think this is going. I think this is the 90s Georgetown model where you got a couple guards who might be a little bit crazy with the ball, might be a little loose, but they're going to dominate the ball and you're going to have to find those guys. You can find those guys to be like heavy usage players to use an NBA term.
Mhm.
And I think, was disappointing this year because you had Dylan and you had Acuff and then to some extent Jeremiah. We kind of thought that they could just control the ball a lot.
Mhm.
And then, other than Ace, your other guys are these more ancillary pieces. I think that is the cheapest way to basically, in effect, play Moneyball, which again is going to be a theme that's coming back to. And then you have your Dortch, you have your Grants, maybe a Gvoli is your third center, or worst case, a second, but you have a legit starting option who can defend the rim. You can kind of get by with that. And that's where, so if that is your style of
Mhm.
play,
Mhm.
then I think there's no reason with 4 or 5 million or even 3 million that you can't at least get a competitive product on the court as you then see some of these things. And then maybe some years, if Dylan Grant develops a 3-point shot or whoever his equivalent is, you move forward. If your Caleb McConnell becomes the best defender in the conference and he's not a liability on offense, that can happen. But you're never going to know if your Caleb McConnell is going to develop if you don't keep guys like that around. And
Right.
so to do that, you're going to have other guys who have that more refined offensive game. Now, if they kept Somerville, maybe you have the reverse where you're relying on for old time Rutgers fans, if they listen, you have your Kelvin Troy's, Strickland's as your guards, and your offense is a post up offense.
Mhm.
Now, without Somerville, maybe you go. I think they're going to go with the first approach I said, because I think the other approach to your question is going to be more costly. Keeping big men who have these skill sets is much more costly. And then, yeah, you might be able to find some, 6'2" guys who are going to be playing on the playgrounds in Newark in a few years, hustling money, or in Europe for a few years. Maybe you can find those guys, which Rutgers never has found. But I think, the point on the percentile is accurate. Like, we're just trying to be better than mid-majors, top mid-majors. And if you can do that, then I think you're putting yourself in a position to reach the middle of the Big Ten, which is sufficient to reach the tournament. And that's where I don't think you can concentrate on, should we focus on beating Purdue now? No. We got to focus on being the best team in New Jersey or this area and go from there. Because that's how I think you're going to generate the funds. That Rutgers is the team. It's not Seton Hall. It's not Princeton. It's not St. John's, which is, again, it's its own story. But I think that's what your goal has to be right now while we're in this changing landscape.
And so to kind of piggyback off of that, I mean, there's a couple things that, I kind of thought about while you were answering that question there and kind of giving your thoughts on it. One, I mean, if we currently have 1.5 million and the range was, the 90th was 3 million, obviously we want to get a little bit more than that, but we had some money, and there's all this talk about all this money we don't have. I understand we're not competing with the upper tier, but we want to be better, just in the middle of the pack, at least, I guess, in the mid majors, which we weren't this year. We could go back. I know it was a different world, but when we were a bubble team, I think most people would have at least taken that right now. So while we're kind of waiting, treading water in the middle there, we're not at the bottom. Maybe we're at the bottom of the upper tier teams. Fine. One, is this AD gonna help us because we mismanaged some of the funds last year, or simply put our money on the wrong guy, meaning Acuff got hurt, or we thought these other guys were going to step in a certain way and they didn't, and this AD will be able to execute a better vision as far as allotting the money to the right 5 to 7 pieces to make it a coherent team. And on the other end, with a head coach like Steve Peichel, who emphasizes defense so much, you could have those 2-3 guards and you could put money on those 2-3 guards, but I think you're going to need those other 3-4 guys to be legitimate defensive ability, high energy, glue, rebounding guys. And do those guys start to come at a premium? And if not, if you can financially figure out where to fit them, where do you find them? Because Steve's got this certain system, and we're changing out guys every year. We develop a guy and he's going to want to go, or he's going to want more money, like a Mag. Like, I know Cliff would, I won't use Cliff because it was the 5th year, but these guys are going to develop. Can this AD get us over the hump with those issues, or is this something that remains to be seen with the coaching philosophies? And to piggyback off that with something else you had in our notes here, answering those questions and then pivoting, how far in advance can you look? Can you plot out for 2 years? Or can you plot out for 3? Or is this all just a 1-year cycle? And if so, does that work with this coach? Can that work for any team like Rutgers that doesn't have infinite money? I mean, I know that's a lot to throw at you, but I think it all kind of goes together. And what does this look like for this basketball program?
Yeah, well, I guess the first point to just make is that, for example, in baseball, they can't go to the MLB draft and every single year. You either have to go before you enroll, or you're basically after your 3rd year, give or take, right? And so, and the NFL has protections against that as well, like the whole Maurice Clarett thing. They wouldn't let him in, blah blah blah. So ultimately, I think that the reason that Moneyball worked in baseball was because the smaller market teams were not saddled with these long multi-year contracts that the larger teams were. Now, the Yankees, they can afford Carl Pavano, Jacoby Ellsbury to just be a sunk cost. Like, they got enough money, the Dodgers now, they can just kind of, write it off. But anybody who's trying to get up there, they got to take risks on some of those big contracts. So, I mean, I guess my biggest question that makes it hard to answer your question is, like, when are we seeing 2 and 3 year contracts? Because ultimately that's going to change everything, right? Even if it's a 2-year deal, then at least you can say, okay, we're going to plan for next year. I mean, I think what Rutgers basketball is going to have to do is, I don't think they have a luxury of doing that. Basically, you're going to have to say, all right, we have at least, my philosophy in basketball has been always, after the NBA legal defense era, you can only have one guy on the court who can't shoot at any given time, right? And you can cut maybe 1.5 because maybe one guy's a big guy. He's got to be near the basket, right? But everyone else has to be able to, or else they're a liability. I think the thought for Rutgers is going to be, yeah, Dylan Grant, again, he hit a three-pointer in whatever consecutive games. You see the makings of a guy who will be able to shoot the ball.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have to find some other guys to kind of basically be that pipeline. Like who, and a lot of teams in football have always done a good job with this. Like this guy's in this role, or baseball even. This is this role this year, your utility infielder. Next year, maybe you can be the starting second baseman. And then if you're real good, then maybe you can be the starting shortstop.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of come up with these like mini like elevation paths for people. So you
have
can
that in
kind of
football,
sell
special teams to the nickel
Right.
corner to, I
right.
mean, yeah.
Exactly. So I think for Rutgers basketball, I think they have to just think of it in 2 years. And if a guy wants to leave after 1 year, sorry, it's too bad. But they're not in a position to do that at this point. So my thought would be that's what you kind of have to do, and find as many of these athletic wing types as you can. And, I think you kind of roll the dice on someone like Caden Powers as a 6'5" guy who kind of basically plays the 4 for his high school team. I was never that impressed with watching his film,
Mm-hmm.
but I also see like if you're basically betting on upside and he's not going to cost that much as a true freshman, that's probably a gamble that you have to make in a sense.
Yeah.
Right. Even with limited roster spots. So I do think there's some things for that. And then the other thing I've said, the few times Aaron has let me talk basketball is I think you got to be a pressing team. And it's easier to find guys who are athletic that can press and at least reduce the shot clock for your other team by making them take 10 seconds roughly to get into half court and get organized. Whereas Rutgers this year, for such a long bench that they had of guys who were kind of not, taking the bull by the horns, they didn't do it enough. And you don't have to be a full court one, man-to-man pressing team. So either you need to have a pressing team with a lot of guys who can go in, or you go the opposite and you go Jim Boeheim 2-3 zone approach, where you're only recruiting for 3 positions: the middle, back sides, and the front. You only have 3 positions on defense.
Mm-hmm.
Rotation's not as difficult. They can learn quicker. And Aaron and I talked about this one time. Like, I think if Pike realized that in March last year, a year ago, he might have went with that approach, because there was no, if he would have known earlier that they could not be the man-to-man defense that he needs for his system, the right thing to do would have been abandon ship then, and then go from there. So I think those are kind of your 2 choices. You either have to be, again, if you're budget constrained, because you're only going to be able to afford a couple guys, you're going to need a full bench of guys who are athletic and can press, defend and rebound, and then you press, and then, or you need to just go 2-3 zone model and say, okay, we dare you to shoot over the top on us, but we're going to have the numbers inside the paint,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to make it easier for our players to come up to speed. I mean, Jim Boeheim always was ahead of the curve with being able to play freshmen, and that's why, because they only would have to learn one defensive spot in that, whether it be Jerry McNamara or, any of those other guys, Sean Williams, who came from Patterson Catholic, whoever, right? And so I think those are your kind of 2 choices with how you formulate your basketball team, and you're just basically on a 2-year cycle here, because if anyone who gets too good, they're going to leave.
No, and
the
it makes
NBA or
great
another
sense.
team.
Yeah, and I think so. I guess what you're saying too is you're going to need this GM / head coach relationship to be a collaborative one, which easy, common sense, we know, but I think is a far instead of a unilateral approach, like this is, you're going to execute my vision or vice versa. You're going to have to explore the realities of your budget and mix that with the realities of the philosophy and the philosophical approach to the team. And you're going to have to keep it constrained to a 2-year plan. And when you're looking at the 2 years, what guys can we get at what price and still a lot of money for their second year if they're going to ask for more, they develop properly. How can we budget for 2 years out of these guys, and how can we get the most out of these guys for 2 years? Because we don't have the luxury of the 4 or 5 year development for this certain defensive philosophy, and we don't know what the monetary demands are going to be 3-4 years down the road. How can we constrain this to 2 years, both from a philosophical skill point of view and a monetary point of view, get on the same page with their budget and make it work. And I think you make a good point. Maybe we've got to leave some of Peichel's philosophy with this multi-year development and condense it into a more manageable offense or defensive philosophy that works in the 2-year time plan.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to what you were saying before is I think that's what your GM needs to be. They're going to need to come to Peichel and say, these are all the guys that we think can fill this for us, whichever our approach is, right? Even if he's, a bench guy at, George Washington, which is, a common one we've been talking about with one of the guys Rutgers has been linked to as a wing. Like, there might be guys there that you can find. Now, the question of tampering, I know Richie O'Leary was kind of
I
went
just
on a good
heard
rant
that.
about
Yeah,
that one. About
saying you
that.
got to tamper.
And I mean, we'll see how that goes. But I think it seems like football is ready for guys to open the portal, whether they're tampering or not, I don't know.
Yeah,
right?
no, you're right.
But they know every guy, like on every team, that if this guy were to come in the portal, we call him right away. Maybe he has another offer. Maybe, but right, let's say
and our own
Toledo
guys
is offering a guy. But it's like, well, we can maybe give him the same. But if we call him right now, as soon as he's in there, I think that's. And then the other thing that kind of ties to is agents, right? I think you're going to see agents centralization, and you're going to need your general manager to be that person and then be the advocate. I mean, one of the things you see in real estate, right, is it's not me that's trying to just get the buyer to spend less or the seller to spend to accept lower. I'm representing my buyer. I'm their agent, literally the term agent. And so I think that will give Peichel a little bit of air cover too. If this negotiations with the GM, man, it's not with me. Now, how does that impact your hierarchy of your structure? I'm not sure. But again, that was one of the key pillars of Moneyball is that, the Billy Bean was not buddy with the players.
Right.
And I think the GM might ultimately be in that. I don't like having college athletics be cutthroat like that, but it's kind of been happening for a long time anyway. Now it's just more in the forefront. And so I think that's where it gets complicated is like, who does the buck stop with? Is Steve Peichel an escalation point for the GM? Vice versa. Are they peers perfectly? But I do think regardless of exactly how that shakes out, I think you got to come up with your philosophy and then you got to just pound that philosophy. Unless your GM comes to you and says, this isn't working, the prices are too high, we got to switch. And that's more of like what I think the Patriots did so well for a 20-year reign is like, as things changed, they were even willing to be ahead of the times and make a mistake rather than be behind the times. Yeah. And I think that's where a smart person in this role will say, okay, yeah, let's say we go with the Peichel model now, but we have the 2-3 zone thing in our back pocket that like, if we need to pivot and say like, okay, these guys fit both systems, they come to Steve Peichel and say, okay, these guys fit both systems. These guys we think we can get for on a better budget if we just take this approach this particular year. We still go 3/4 core pressure, 2-2-1, but we played 2-3 on the back end or whatever. Like, I think he'll be able to coach it. He's a smart enough coach to do it. And I think maybe, I'm not sure exactly how the things will shake out, but to what you just said, your coach and your GM have to be on the same page with that type of thing, or else you end up like, the Jets with Todd Bowles and Mike McCann. They're not talking to each other. And like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing here? And so that's kind of where I see a forward-thinking GM might be able to come to Steve with the options and say, this is the financial model for this. This is the play style for this. We got an analytics department over here that does this other thing. I don't think that is impossible on even a $4 million player budget, to answer your first question.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we kind of have a solid foundational take on what, this AD position might look like, how it might work at a place like Rutgers, even with budgetary constraints and time constraints, and how maybe Rutgers could get the most out of it, especially if you keep guys for at least 2 years. I think it does more for the fan interaction, but also for the product on the court and to navigate this. And I think your point regarding football and how it's kind of already on track to do that. And Schiano's already kind of this GM, and he's kind of full on embraced it. We've been lucky in a way to have him navigate this changing landscape, but we're going to have another episode discussing exclusively Schiano and football, and maybe it's ceiling or floor and everything about that. So I'll save that for that episode, and you guys should tune into that. I think that's probably a good place to end here for this particular episode of the mini series. But we are going to have part 2 of embracing the future of college athletics. And I want to talk about, some other philosophical things. How do you deal with player oriented focus? How do you deal with the brave new world of everybody being an individual brand and changing generations and things? We kind of laid down a good framework of how we think it'll work. And we'll touch base when we actually do hire this individual, because it keeps being reported that it is expected at some point. We got to get a president, we got to get an AD, and then this will happen. So we'll come back to give our thoughts on, the hire when it happens and how it fits in and whether or not it matched what we thought was the best working way to do it. But any further thoughts on this topic, on either sport and what people might be looking to expect from our collaboration on Night Watch going forward? Some of the ideas we've had.
No, I mean, I think we've kind of focused a little bit on the general manager, but really we're going to have to flip this on its head and really think about it from a player perspective or an individual athlete perspective, student athlete perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that definitely coming up. And then also, I mean, we talked a little bit about, 2-3 zone, full court press, whatever. And I know this channel isn't a channel where you really get in the nitty gritty of X's and O's, but I think we can probably go a little bit higher than that and just talk about, should football be a pass oriented team or a run oriented team type of thing? And so, and then how does that impact all this other moving parts type of stuff? So those are the type of things where I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation. This is, I guess, depending on how you look at it, my first or second appearance on Night Watch, if you count our collaboration we did with that was basically on all the podcast groups. But it was great talking to you, Larry, and I look forward to talking more and hearing what kind of feedback people have so far.
Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation we had. I know I did, and props to Mike Broadbent over at the Night Report who put that collab together back then. And that I'll give him the credit on that one. We just reposted it on our channel, so I'll say this is our first appearance on Night Watch officially with me being the platform, and I look forward very much to continuing the conversation and bringing the listeners out there more content. Remember, we're available as an audio podcast as well as right here on Night Watch, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and go and listen to us on every major platform on your ride to work, whatever else. We are going to continue to bring you the content even in the off season, and we'll talk to you soon. Oh, and by the way, Dave, where else can they find you, by the way, in your content? I know you have.
I mean, really, for sports wise these days, I'm really just on Off Tackle Empire, which is part of SB Nation. So it used to be out on the banks, and then the Off Tackle Empire is basically the Big Ten aggregate. So there's writers for every team. It's been a little bit slow over there because I've been busy outside, right? But that's really where I'll contribute to a lot of roundtables and do spring content, things like that. And then I've got an upcoming appearance on Aaron's podcast, if we can ever get that going, to talk about spring football practice as well. That's the Scarlet Faithful. So thanks again for having me. And over back to you, Larry.
Yes, sir. So make sure you tune into the Scarlet Faithful, where David has and Aaron have great content. I get all my game previews and everything else there, and we'll continue to do so. And all the other content creators out there, we're all kind of, learning from each other. And what we do is, we source information and perspectives, and then that gives a lot to talk about to all of Rutgers Nation out there. So we will talk to you guys very soon. Everybody enjoy their rainy week. Hopefully it clears up a little bit, and look for the next episode. Talk to you later.